political activist with the Committee for the Republic of Canada. And today's conference is in a series of conferences we've had and we will continue to have till we achieve our goal. I just want to make a few opening remarks before introducing Dennis and before he gives his presentation. What I want to say is that we are at a point where we are witnessing profound changes in the world. And the recent stunning, the recent, the best example is the recent stunning, powerful, total repudiation, cancellation of the murderous policies in Greece, with the near landslide victory of the Syriza party and the independent Greek parties. This is the best example of people's outpouring, coming into the streets and rejecting the oligarchical system and standing up for the dignity of man. This is again a reflection of what is happening, what's already happened with half of humanity in terms of the BRICS nations. And this is something that my organization, Dennis LaRouche, is at the center of. Because some of the people, the present government of Greece, are not only aware of our role worldwide, our historic role in shaping the present situation, but many of them have also been in contact with us, and some of them have spoken at our conferences, such conferences in the past, and have actually organized with us on the issues of Glass-Steagall and protecting the dignity of the population. And what you have right now, today, you will hear from Dennis Stephen, who has been a collaborator of LaRouche and this process for the past 4 years. And is central to what among our organization is known as the Manhattan Project. Because Manhattan has been the battleground between forces, the American patriotic forces, and the imperial British forces who have sought to destroy the America. And over the past recent month, the whole political topography of Manhattan has been severely shifted by what we have done, by deploying young people into the streets, into organizations, and by holding conferences with other institutions in Manhattan. And this fight has been centrally to get the United States to break with the empire and join the BRICS. Because if we don't do that today, if we don't do that right now, we are looking at a thermonuclear war possibility, a confrontation between the United States, Russia, and China on the other side. So our intention is to get people here to mobilize with us into that process, into discovering the real soul of not just the United States, but also civilization per se, which the Greek people have discovered. And Manhattan is very important, I'll just make a few words, because this has been the home of leading American patriots, like Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Treasury Secretary of the United States and the founder of what we know as the American credit system, or the American system of political economy. It's also the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose birthday was yesterday, which we celebrate today. So with that in mind, with these thoughts in mind, I'd like to introduce Dennis Stephen.
Well, since I come from the United States, and despite myself, am affected by the cultural and commercial characteristics of the United States, I will first offer you all a deal. Americans always have deals. It goes like this. In the United States, whenever the presidential elections come around, people are encouraged to take as much as a year of their lives to elect some character to become president of the United States. I say some character because recently we haven't had qualified people running for that office. When I say recently, I mean the last 40 years approximately, which is relatively recent for some of us, such as myself, who've been doing this for this long. But in this case, I'm going to make a deal with you. Our idea is that you and those who may come in the course of the next hour and a half should, we urge you, make a deal with us that for the next 6 months, you throw yourself together with us completely into a process of doing two things at once. Preventing what could be, as they say, a complete wipeout, including of human civilization. But secondly, more usefully, positively, creating what could be the most dramatic change in a short period of time in human history that would have happened in the world, certainly since 1989 at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and maybe the most profound change in human history since approximately 1347 to 1350, about roughly almost 700 years ago. Now, so here's what's up. There has been, as was already said, a dramatic shift in the world. It started in 2013, 2 years ago, when the president of China, in the course of having a discussion with various nations, made it clear that he was committed, and that nation was committed, to what he referred to as a New Silk Road policy. The New Silk Road it's not the Silk Road that people may be familiar with, the Bitcoin version. No, this is not the 2-Bitcoin version of Silk Road. This is the real one. This is a policy outlook that had been co-developed with the Chinese government by our organization between 1993 and 1996. It was then secret and became manifest in public in 1996 at a conference in Beijing, where the founder of the Schiller Institute and the wife of Linda LaRouche, Helga LaRouche, gave a keynote presentation at that time. There were 37 nations that were present, and out of that conference came what was called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And then a process began between 1997 and now, which had a lot of twists and turns, and there were a lot of setbacks. But that process resulted in the period of 2013 in the summer of President Xi Jinping announcing that his nation was committed to this policy. Immediately subsequent to that discussion, he visited Indonesia and Thailand. And on the occasion of that visit, particularly to Indonesia, he announced the creation of what he called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now this is important because this was the beginning of the announcement of several such banking institutions, all of which had one objective and would then be actualized or activated in a different way this past July 17th, 2014, in Fortaleza, Brazil. On the occasion of the Fortaleza Conference, which happened and included also the nation of Argentina, at that point, it became clear that a new regime, a new alternative for the planet had crystallized, and crystallized in the form of the nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and also Argentina. Now, the Argentinian addition was very important because Argentina had just been engaged in a repudiation of the United States' courts system, asserting that Argentina must pay an unjust debt to a set of American hedge fund traders who were demanding a 1,600% return on their actual investment, as they call it, They had purchased this portion of Argentinian debt at a discount, and they had gone to the courts in New York in particular to demand full payment. And the Argentinians said no, because you are saying that you want payment on the so-called leveraged value of your instrument. And we're not paying anybody at that rate. We're paying everyone in a consistent way at what we judge to be equitable debt repayment arrangements that we've made with everybody else. So the courts ruled against Argentina, and basically, Argentina decided to take a page out of the verbal notebook of Victoria Nuland. You may know who Victoria Nuland is, but if you don't know who she is, she famously, in a recorded conversation, recorded by Russian intelligence, in referring to her, first of all, allies in Europe, which she was supposedly defending by extending the largesse of Europe to Ukraine by creating a coup in Ukraine to install a government there. She was taped, and in referencing her close friends in Europe, she used the phrase, I think everyone is old enough here to hear this, you've probably heard of these things before, fuck the EU, fuck the European Union, which was a sort of a fair expression of her deep regard and admiration for Western and European culture and economics and politics. Well, the Argentinians sort of took a page out of her vocabulary, and they basically said, fuck the US courts. They just walked away. Now, that's an interesting position, because that's actually a position which is something that had been discussed many, many years earlier by Lyndon LaRouche, the president of Mexico, then president of Mexico, Lopez Portillo, who had done exactly that in the summer of 1982 when he nationalized the banks of Mexico at the recommendation of Lyndon LaRouche. He met with LaRouche during May of that year, and then as a result of that meeting, LaRouche wrote a proposal for the president of Mexico called Operation Juarez, after the great Mexican and American patriot Benito Juarez, the founder of Mexico. And basically what he stated was that the nation of Mexico should not pay usurious debt to the International Monetary Fund. And that meant that a nationalistic action had to be taken by the president of Mexico to assert the sovereignty of Mexico over its financial destiny and future. Well, this is exactly what Argentinian repudiation of the usurious debt was. Let me also point out that this was the debt to a hedge fund. This was not a debt to the American government or to another state. And it was a debt to a set of financial institutions that had been bailed out, in fact, illegally, in the United States by the United States Congress. Well, what happened at that meeting in Fortaleza, Brazil, was that this BRICS nations process, involving over half of humanity, as was already said, surfaced and crystallized. And from that point, there has been a global world war that has been being conducted. You are presently sitting in the middle of processes that can only be compared to those of 1914, 1915, 100 years ago. You are presently sitting where people were sitting in July and August of 1939 before September 1st of 1939 and the declaration of World War II. And many people are in the same mental frame of mind that they were at that time. They had no idea that this was going on. Now, our organization's viewpoint and our organization's practice has been, for decades, to never worry about things you can't do anything about, but rather correct and fix things that you can both control or influence. That's always how we've operated. And that's why we have successfully, on several occasions, despite the fact that we were told that it was impossible to do so, made policy for nations. Now, that doesn't often happen by our being acknowledged as being the good guys in making policy. For example, we tried to make policy for the Soviet Union, or with the Soviet Union, back in 1981 and 82, and they refused. At that time, we were trying to tell them that there was the only way that you could possibly stop nuclear war is that you had to supersede the technology of nuclear weapons, and you had to do that jointly with the United States to create a form of technology that could render those weapons impotent and obsolete. That is to say, so that I can be very clear about this, you will never reduce the world's nuclear weapons stockpile to an acceptable level, including if you reduce it to 1% of its present level. If you got rid of 99% of the nuclear weapons in the world, all that would do is reduce your nuclear exchange to the equivalent of a nuclear winter, in which basically everybody on the planet would either freeze to death or starve to death. Who was left after the exchange? I mean, that's the best you can do. That's if you get rid of 99% of the weapons. And, of course, what we've seen since the time that we were having this discussion with the Russians, which was actually 33 years ago, we've had a refinement of nuclear weapons. They become more lethal, more precise, and more quick start. We've had a lessening of the nuclear window. So you'll never get past it. What you have to do is to supersede the technology. No weapon in human history which has been created has ever not been used. There's no way to create a situation in which that weapon were not used except to supersede the technology. So I reference this because what happened was that the Soviet Union said no. And this was in the period of January of 1983. And this was an indirect discussion. Let me be very explicit about this. This was a set of discussions that Lyndon LaRouche was personally carrying out with a representative of the Russian government, Soviet Union government, by the name of Sherzhnev. He was the Russian ambassador to the United States, assigned to Washington. We also had contacts at the United Nations at the time. And these negotiations had gone on for over a year. And for reasons we won't go through here, they refused. We told them at the time, if you refuse this, within 5 years, your nation will cease to exist, or may cease to exist. Now, we didn't mean by that what happened was going to happen in the way it did. Lyndon LaRouche did not know that. He was simply saying that the trajectory that the Soviet Union was on at that time meant that in a designated, knowable period of time, it would cease to exist. And part of the reason for that is that over 60% of all of the domestic product of that nation was deployed within its military. Today, over 65% of all of the domestic product of the United States is deployed within its military. The United States will cease to exist within a 5-year period if it does not change its policies. This is important for you to know as an assertion. You don't have to agree with it, but you have to understand that the world we've entered is knowable, it is changeable, but it is not avoidable. It is knowable, it is changeable, but it is not avoidable. So when I talk about my deal of 6 months, which is a pretty good deal, I'm doing that in a certain context because I don't believe in being afraid. Or let's put it a little bit different. I don't believe in being terrified. Being afraid is fine, see, but terrified is different. See, only a fool is not afraid when confronted with true danger. Matter of fact, that's how you get mobilized to do something about it. But if you're terrified, then you're paralyzed. Greece is interesting because the defense minister of Greece, now defense minister, the new defense minister, spoke at our Schiller Institute conference in Germany a few months back. And I reference that because the party that won the election, the Syriza party, 6 years ago, got only 3% of the vote in that country. They had something like, I think, 6 people in the parliament. This time, in these elections, they received 37% of the vote. They have 149 seats. And they have a corresponding independent Greek party, of which the defense minister is a member, which received another approximately 13 seats. So what's relevant about our friend Mr. Komenos, who came to our meeting in Germany, is that he also came to the United States and he was there to organize with our people at the Congress to reinstate Franklin Roosevelt's Glass-Steagall policy. In that name, I mean, that's what he was talking about. And he's talking about that now with the economics minister, the finance minister of Greece today. These people have the policy of implementing what Franklin Roosevelt did. It was mentioned that yesterday was his birthday, so let's just say something about what Franklin Roosevelt did within 24 hours of being inaugurated President of the United States. What happened was, he was inaugurated on March 4th, giving a famous speech in which he said at the time that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes. That is what we cannot tolerate. Fear is fine, but not terror. And what had happened to the country was that the country, the United States then, had been terrorized by the Great Depression, the failure of the stock market in October of 1929, and then a series of years of ratcheting down of the living standards of the population, with a president who refused to act on behalf of the general welfare of the people of the United States, or the people of the world for that matter. And so Roosevelt, who had known something about conquering fear himself, because he had contracted polio, he was paralyzed, he was shriveled from the waist down, and he had never publicly admitted that he had that disease. Matter of fact, he always made it appear that he could walk, although he could not. The way he did this was he did this together with his son, James, who would always accompany him, and he created this way of sort of dancing on the top of his body, very powerful upper torso. And he would lean forward, basically, back and forth, so he gave the illusion to make it look like he could walk. He'd been told that he had to stay out of politics, that he would never go back into politics. And together with his wife, Eleanor, and his advisor, Louis Howe, he had defied that, become governor of New York and then president of the United States. Roosevelt did not go to the inaugural ball that night. Perhaps he had been awakened because of the fact that about 2 weeks before he got to the White House, he'd almost been killed in Florida when an assassin had shot but missed him because a woman in the crowd deflected his arm. And instead, the mayor of Chicago was killed. He wasn't killed immediately or instantaneously. He died about a month later, Mayor Cermak of Chicago. So he was shot instead, and Roosevelt was missed. So perhaps Franklin Roosevelt thought, I better not go to the inauguration because I don't have any time to lose. And what he did was, sometime about 2 a.m., between midnight and 2 a.m., he called a meeting. And this was on Saturday, or Sunday morning, early Sunday morning of March 5th. And he announced basically on Monday that all the banks in the United States, every bank, was going to be shut down. And that's what they did. They shut every bank in the country. They have to understand that that wasn't exactly as revolutionary as it sounds because, for example, on a single day in 1932, half of the farms in the state of Mississippi were foreclosed on. People lost half of the farms in the state in one single day. So those kinds of dramatic and negative events had been very much in evidence. So in this case, this was a dramatic positive event. Close all the banks, and now what he did was send inspectors into every one of the banks to see what's going on here. And if they found that the bank was in some fashion crooked, that is to say that they had basically taken a large portion of the investments of the depositors, normal people, the farmers and the laborers of the country, and they were using this money for speculative purposes, they shut the bank and kept it shut, and they would go through its books until they were able to return that bank to a proper functioning where they separated out the stock market speculation from the investments, that is the deposits of the people. And then the bank would reopen. You should know that some banks didn't open for 20 years. And some banks never reopened. Some banks opened in 3 days, 4 days. And this measure, at that time, didn't have a name, but 3 months later it was given the name Glass-Steagall after the two sponsors of the bill in the House of Representatives in the United States Senate. Both of them were Southerners. Both of them actually were racists. Both of them were not good guys, but they recognized at the time, and this is an important point to make for our general narrative, that they needed to act because action and action now was decisive to the survival of the nation. And the President of the United States was demanding such action and action now. This is not our circumstance in the United States today. Our circumstance in the United States today is such that for the period from September 11, 2001 until now, we have lived in the United States under a de facto police state and dictatorship. This is not readily admitted by the citizens of the United States, and therefore the delusion that something else is going on has resulted in a process much similar to the period between 1929 and 1932, before Roosevelt came into power, in which you've had a continuous process of looting of the population, combined, however, with one additional feature, the global extension of war, the global propagation of war. And of course, there are nuclear weapons now, and they weren't nuclear weapons then. So these are the factors that are additional. With these additional factors, and with no one home in the White House between 2001 and now, the circumstance that we find ourselves in is remarkably significantly worse than in 1932. But, as I said before, the situation is knowable and changeable. It's just not avoidable. Having illusions about the mental capacities or emotional capacities of a Barack Obama as distinguished from those of a George Bush is an exercise in futility. Doesn't exist, but there's a reason. And it's only fair to give people that reason, because if you don't really sort of allow any group of people who sort of walked into the middle of the movie to know how they got to where they are, it's unfair. It's unfair to keep, they keep asking you questions and the movie's playing and you're telling them to shut up and just watch it, and they can't figure out, why anything is going on. So that's unfair. And so in order to be able to give you an idea of why that circumstance is as it is, we're going to show a short clip from a 1999 video made, which features LaRouche. It's called Storm Over Asia. It's about 4 minutes approximately that will play, and then I will say something about a period just before that. And before we introduce it, just to say, this was made in 1999, so this is made before 9/11, and is is offered here as a way of putting a context around the last 16 years as to what has actually been going on.
What you're seeing is a war in the North Caucasus region on southern Russia. What you're also seeing is a war which is broken out simultaneously in the border between Pakistan and India. The forces behind these attacks on Russia and on India are the same. They are a mercenary force which was first set into motion by policies adopted at a trilateral commission meeting in Kyoto, Japan in 1975. The policies originally of Brzezinski and his number two man there, Samuel P. Huntington. The policies which were continued by then trilateral commission member, that is back in 1975, George Bush, before he became vice president. These are policies which were continued by George Bush as vice president. This is under Bush, this became known as the Iran-Contra drug finance link operations of mercenaries deployed with private funding all over the world, recruited from Islamic and other countries, and targeting Russia's flank. This mercenary force, created then, still exists. The primary responsibility for creating the force was the government of the United Kingdom, most notably, most emphatically, the government of Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, a policy which has been accelerated and continued in full madness by the present Prime Minister, Tony Blair of the United Kingdom. This war, if continued, using mercenaries, can lead to nuclear general war. The major powers principally threatened today by this mercenary operation are two of the world's largest nations, China and India. China on its western borders, India on its northern borders. Of course, Iran is also threatened, but more notably, Russia. If these nations are pushed to the wall by a continuing escalation of a war, which is modeled on the wars which the British ran against Russia, China, and so forth during the 19th century and early 20th century, this will lead to the point that Russia has to make the decision to accept disintegration of Russia as a nation, or to resort to the means it has to exact terrible penalties on those who are attacking it, going closer and closer to the source, the forces behind the mercenaries, which includes, of course, Turkey, which is a prime NATO asset being used as a cover for much of this mercenary operation in the North Caucasus and in Central Asia. This is our danger. The weapons the Russians have are no longer the large armies, the capabilities we thought of under the old Orgokov plan of the 1980s. Those vast armies are dissipated, weakened. Russia is ruined almost by a vast economic destruction caused by IMF policies and related policies. But Russia still has an arsenal of advanced weapons, and laboratories which can match the weaponry, most advanced weaponry being developed in the United States, Israel, Britain, and elsewhere. If Russia is pushed to the wall, where it decides to disintegrate willfully or fight back, the likely thing is it will fight back. It will use the weapons it has. It does not have the weapons to win a war, but it has the weapons sufficient to impose a powerful, deadly deterrent on the nations behind the mercenary forces which are presently attacking it. There lies the danger. Unfortunately, most people in the United States are living under the delusion that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the combined military power of the United States and its British Commonwealth allies, including Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, countries that are really under the British Queen personally, as the United Kingdom is, believe that these forces, Anglo-American forces, are so powerful that they can ignore the United Nations Security Council and conduct wars on their own with impunity. Most Americans tend to believe that and believe they don't have to worry about foreign wars. They don't have to worry about terrible things happening in Africa or South America or Eurasia generally. It won't come here, just as many Americans said before Pearl Harbor about the war then ongoing in Europe. In reality, it can come here. I'm not predicting that it will. I'm saying the likelihood, the danger exists. And as long as the present policies of our government continue, especially the policies of the right-wing Stone Age faction inside the Congress, the right-wing policies of Vice President Al Gore and of Madeleine Albright, a Brzezinski associate, as long as these policies on the United States' part continue, the danger of war is growing.
Okay. I don't think I have to make any comment about that, since it could have been a press release from last week. And therein lies essentially, so you will, an introduction of what will be part two of what we're going to be looking at today, and or taking up today, which is how do you know these things before they happen? Because they are knowable, as I said before, and therefore changeable. I want to just indicate something concerning the BRICS nations and the collaboration between Russia and China. And this is a quote from a document that was issued in May of last year from a meeting that happened in Shanghai involving Vladimir Putin and the president of China. In the final communique, one paragraph from that communique stated that one goal of the collaboration between the nations was, quote, increasing the effectiveness of collaboration in high technology areas, priority projects in the international use of nuclear energy, civil aviation, and a program of cooperation in basic research on space flight, satellite observation of the Earth, satellite navigation, and research into deep space and manned space travel. Now, the particular occasion was that they were signing a natural gas treaty, which is worth $400 billion. I think the largest treaty of its type ever signed. 30-year period. But that's what it's. Well, that's what the value of it is. But in the communique, they emphasized, as I said, this collaboration on deep space and space research. And I want to now take that up from the standpoint of now giving you sort of the, not an inside track, but a way of thinking about what we're actually seeing. So this took us from 1999. This was made in 1999. There were references made to Zbigniew Brzezinski. We'll take him up in a moment. But let's go back to this moment. What the great issue of the war is. The issue is not that Russia, China, India, and many other countries have now banded themselves together as a new economic and financial bloc against the IMF, World Bank, and the European Union, European Commission, transatlantic nations, and Wall Street. It is not that. Now, that's what people will who are geostrategists and people who are political activists and so on normally will talk about. That's not us. This is important to state because there's a reason that we seem to somehow always survive and many of these people don't. We're not that. No, the real issue is the 50-plus year war concerning thermonuclear fusion and deep space exploration. That is the secret. That is the secret of the true strategic conflict in the world. Thermonuclear fusion power and the commercial development of same has been a policy outlook that has been being contested since the time of Dwight Eisenhower. Now, it's crucial to understand what this is because, of course, with the development of the nuclear weapon, most people sort of stop right there. They sort of say, you paralyzed me when you know, at nuclear. So they don't even want to get to thermonuclear and the development of hydrogen bombs, which they forget occurred almost immediately. And that the Russians, in fact, were the first to develop the thermonuclear bomb, the fusion bomb. That you detonate a fission bomb as a trigger for a nuclear fusion bomb. And this is when you get into what's called, or has been referred to before, as the doomsday machine, which is made famous in the 1964 film Dr. Strangelove, among other places. Dwight Eisenhower recognized by the time he was leaving the presidency that what had happened was that there had been a dramatic change in world military policy. And we're going to call it military war policy. We're not going to call it defense policy, which is an Orwellian trick. You say it's defense, really you're conducting war. So in warfighting policy, what Dwight Eisenhower realized was that the war policy and doctrine of the United States had been permanently altered by a war establishment that came into existence in 1945 as of August 6th. The function of the release and the dropping of the atomic bomb was to create a permanent change in American war policy, to create that. This was something that was done by Winston Churchill and was campaigned for by Winston Churchill, who then manifested that campaign in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, where he gave the famous Iron Curtain speech. It was not Truman, it was not the United States who announced the beginning of the Cold War. It was Churchill and Britain at Fulton, Missouri. And it was Churchill who accomplished that change in American policy over the dead body of his enemy, Franklin Roosevelt. Now, what occurred was that the United States, after every war it had ever fought, demobilized its military. Because in American military strategic policy, the idea was, until that time, that civilian armies were the basis of the defense of the Republic. What's sometimes referred to as militia. Today that's taken on a completely different meaning, but until 1945 it merely meant that all citizens were called upon to defend the Republic, and all citizens were demobilized afterwards until you had sort of a minimal military. But that was changed because the nuclear bomb being dropped changed it. The nuclear weapon was not dropped to stop World War II. There was no necessity whatsoever for the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. No military necessity in terms of the ending of the war. The Russians had 1 million troops poised to invade Japan, and Japan had been devastated by the firebombings that had been done by the raids over Tokyo, particularly in other locations. I mean, the firebombing was absolutely devastating. So there was no, in fact, there had been negotiations with the Japanese government going on from the late spring and early summer of 1945, which were being done by Cardinal Montini, later Pope Paul VI, and by American representatives, including from the OSS, one of whom, by the name of Max Corvo, told this story explicitly to Lyndon LaRouche before he died. It's also notable, by the way, just for anybody who can check this, that wants to check it, that both MacArthur and General Patton, George Patton, opposed the dropping of the bombs. Even Patton. So those bombs were not dropped for that purpose. They were dropped for the purpose of creating a permanent military establishment in the United States. Now, once that had occurred, there was no way to stop it. Now, Eisenhower was not president then. He became president after defeating Truman in the election. And at that point, what Eisenhower attempted was something called atoms for peace. The notion of the peaceful use of nuclear explosives for construction and so forth and so on. And the development of the nuclear power plants and so forth, which was opposed by the military. The United States military opposed the creation of commercial, industrial, nuclear power. They wanted it kept as only a military option. Now, by no later than 1956-57, there were already early forays in research into thermonuclear fusion. By the time we got to the 1960s, Kennedy, in particular, with his Apollo space program, was aware that Russia, particularly with its laser fusion research, did not have the capability to develop thermonuclear fusion, but was working in areas of research that would require the United States to collaborate with Russia on advanced weaponry, and that cooperation could possibly lead to some form of actual final supersession of the nuclear chicken game. He wasn't fond, that is, Kennedy was not fond of what he had to do on those 13 days in October of 1962, when he almost was forced by General Curtis LeMay and other nuts among the American military to go to war with the Soviet Union by bombing Cuba, which almost happened. Khrushchev also wasn't fond of what happened on his end, but the Kennedys in particular wanted to stop the nuclear chicken game. And they recognized what I said earlier. You can only do that by superseding these technologies. Anyway, thermonuclear fusion, which had been achieved in the bomb, was also capable, theoretically, of being made commercially viable. And what was relevant about this, what was attractive, was that there's no waste product from thermonuclear fusion. That the waste product is water. And that the fuel source is also deuterium and tritium derived from seawater. But there has been a change that you should all know, which has entered into the situation and was recognized by Kennedy in his moon program. Now, you've often been told, probably, that the moon program was a kind of space race with the Russians to see who could get to the moon first. But if you've ever thought about that, didn't you ever ask the question, well, wait a minute, well, why was it important to get to the moon first? Now, you might have thought, oh, so if you were able to get that far up, then you could put nuclear platforms in the sky, which meant that you could basically bomb somebody with a nuclear missile from space. I mean, you probably thought that. Well, it makes sense that you would have thought that. But if you were thinking about thermonuclear fusion, you would have thought a bit further. You would have recognized that there were scientists, such as the German scientist Kraft Erika, who recognized that if you could industrialize the moon, and later, of course, this became corroborated by the landing man on the moon and the taking of soil samples, that the moon's surface had on it a substance called helium-3, very rare on Earth, but very plentiful on the moon. Helium-3 is an ideal fuel for the thermonuclear fusion process because if you use helium instead of deuterium or tritium, you don't release random neutrons, a sort of energetic, a neutron is an energetic particle that tends to bounce around the inside of a reactor. And that's what the problem is with tokamak designs or other designs of thermonuclear fusion. So I make this clear so people understand me. When you split an atom, it's called fission. But when you fuse an atom, that's fusion. That means that you don't explode the atom, you implode it. And there is not an apparent, there's not a release of a charge, well, excuse me, there's not a release of forms of nuclear waste with that. But there's still the problem of how you confine the reaction. In other words, it's called inertial confinement. How can you actually make sure that the reaction is such that it is able to be controlled and it doesn't damage your reactor? This is, of course, the process that goes on in the sun. And, of course, we have achieved on Earth temperatures hotter than those of the inside of the sun. But with helium-3, you don't produce random neutrons, you produce protons. It means that you have the capacity for direct conversion of electricity. You no longer go on with the idea of boiling water to create steam, to turn turbines, and all this kind of thing. It's an extraordinarily efficient process. The entire Chinese lunar program is devoted to this. Well, the American lunar program also was, actually, but then that ended. It ended with the assassination of Kennedy, actually. Because what Kennedy had understood was that there was a means and a method and a way to permanently end the threat of thermonuclear war on the planet. And that was to create commercial and commercially available cheap power, which had as its waste product water. And further, that a spin-off of this were the creation of plasma torches, which right now, by the way, exist. We can talk about that a little bit later, which can convert any form of waste to other forms of matter. Let me repeat that so you understand what I just said. I am telling you that the processes involved in commercial thermonuclear fusion and the research areas thereunto attached are capable now of converting any form of waste to other forms of matter. That the periodic table of the elements, as you understand it, has been completely revolutionized. That the idea of actually making this commercially achievable and viable requires a crash program equivalent to that of the Apollo program, and now would require every nation of the world, or at least the leading nations of the world in these areas, to collaborate. The Russians refer to this as the Strategic Defense of the Earth, the SDE. They take that name from the earlier Ronald Reagan SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. That earlier Ronald Reagan program was created by Lyndon LaRouche, by our organization. And it was created by our organization because we were getting slammed on nuclear fusion. Let me explain what happened. In 1974, we created something called the Fusion Energy Foundation. And what we successfully did over a 6-year period was we built the largest science organization and science publication, by the way, outside of Scientific American in the country, at about 100,000 subscribers. We passed a bill in the United States Congress. It was initiated by a man by the name of Mike McCormick. He was from Washington State. And that bill was a 20-year crash program, Apollo program for thermonuclear fusion. The bill passed the Congress and the Senate and was signed into law by then President Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, who we politically opposed, but because of his own background in engineering, as a nuclear engineer otherwise, knew exactly what this was about. Even though he didn't really agree with us politically, he knew what we were doing on this, and he signed it into law. That is still the law in the United States, and it has never been implemented. Why? Because it would work, that's why. It would eliminate fossil fuels, period. And of course, if you eliminate fossil fuels, then you eliminate the pretext for war based on raw materials. And that's why it was never implemented. So what happened was, the bill got passed, Reagan got elected, and LaRouche used a walk-in from the Soviet Union. Walk-in meant this. We used to have our office on 58th Street in Manhattan. And so you went, 12 blocks, 16 blocks the other way, and it's over on the east side. And one day, a Russian representative walked into our office. It was during 1980, late 1980, early 1981, just right after the elections had happened. Reagan had just been elected, and he said that they had noted that despite the fact that they had been assured by various of their contacts and their own research that Jimmy Carter was going to be reelected, Ronald Reagan was reelected, and that we had been saying that that was going to happen. And therefore, they wanted to engage with us in a kind of discussion about American politics and American trends and so forth. Well, we knew when that happened that that couldn't be real. They weren't there to say that to us. That's the kind of situation where what you do is you immediately get in touch with the federal government, because if you don't, you are going to be quickly brought up on espionage charges, because like when they walked in, that is not what they were talking about. So that's what we did. We contacted the National Security Council, people in the National Security Council, talked to them about it and said, well, here's what the Russians are proposing to us, what do we do? Is this something that we can go ahead and do? You may be asking here, what does that mean? You're becoming agents of the government? No, we were intending to have these discussions, but we didn't want to get arrested for having the discussions. We also had some people in the Reagan administration who have been following our work in the Fusion Energy Foundation. And they knew that we knew more about, or had gained a knowledge of this process over years that made our publication very important. We were talking to a lot of American scientists, so they said, yeah, why don't you guys go ahead and talk to them. And that's how we were negotiating with the Russians for a year on what later got defamed and turned into something called Star Wars, which involved missiles, which our program never involved. But it's important for you to know that the program never involved it. Now, why is this important to you? Because right now, here is what is going on. The Russians have proposed strategic defense of the Earth. The Chinese have already said they intend to do mining on the moon of helium-3. That's their program. They are turning out fusion scientists. Let me repeat that. Fusion scientists by the thousands right now in China for programs that don't exist. Because they are vectored toward the only future that everybody knew had to come into existence from 1957. Now, we knew what that was, and that's what our organization was doing. And what happened was this. Now, hold on, because this is relevant to correcting what may be your misperception of Barack Obama. What happened was something called the environmentalist movement was created by factions of the American defense establishment to attack nuclear power in order to attack fusion power. See, you never mentioned fusion. You just went after nuclear plants, and what do you do with the waste and the this and the that? Now, some of those questions were legitimate. There's problems with waste with nuclear plants, particularly the old plants. No, absolutely true. But what was actually happening was you were creating a situation where as soon as you use the term nuclear or thermonuclear, everybody is paralyzed with fear. So when you say commercial application, we don't want that. Meanwhile, the nuclear arsenals are like getting bigger and then smaller but more refined and more lethal and, you know, more sexy and so faster. So the environmentalists get deployed, and there are a lot of well-meaning people there who think they're doing the right thing. But at the end of the day, what you have is no commercial thermonuclear fusion process in the West. But you're getting that happening in Russia, you're getting it happening in China, but they can't say that to you. So what happens is what they're talking about is somehow this new communist threat. They would actually say that, they'd like to say that about Russia, but they can't because it's not exactly right. But China, you can still get away with saying that. So now Xi Jinping is supposed to be a kind of neo-Maoist. If you're listening to some of the things, listen to NPR, one of these things, you'll hear it. He's a neo-Maoist. And you get this sort of thing. So I'm telling you about this because this is the actual war. And what we're going to do is we are going to propose, or we have proposed, and that's the relevance of our report on this, the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, that 300-page report, which we'll come back to. This is a way for us to campaign in the transatlantic nations for an alliance with the BRICS nations. That's what we're doing. Now, here's the problem. If we leave that only up to being a simple political approach, it ain't going to work. And I'll tell you why it won't work. We're not going to convince a bunch of people, for example, in their teens and 20s, that that objective that I just named is itself, you know, something that they ought to commit their lives to making happen in that way. Why? Because it's still, what I've said so far is still very rooted in the 20th century. I mean, the whole thing is still rooted in the 20th century. If you're, 18 years old, then that means that you were basically, what, 2 years old when 9/11 happened? Or I said 3, 4 years old. So your consciousness, even of any politics, and let's just say American just for the moment, you're conscious of what, 2 presidents, basically. Right? Bush, 43, and Barack Obama. You might, if you're a historian, you know something about Bill Clinton. So I mean, it's tough to sell people of that age on the idea that this whole sort of Game of Thrones or something, I don't know what I would call this thing I just described, it's really something that they're supposed to commit their lives to somehow getting involved in. It just doesn't, it's not going to move them. And I guess we could scare everybody and just say we're all going to blow up and die. That works for some people. We get some more people that way, I guess. But it's not going to really cause people to be moved from the inside. Now, here's what we're now going to do. We're going to show you something that we showed last night on our international webcast that we do. I guess you probably all know we do a webcast every Friday. And there was a section of that webcast that was done by Jason Ross. Here's why we're going to show you this now. And I want to say something about this because it's not so much that it's difficult, but it's so different from anything you ever see from a so-called political organization that I now have to say something autobiographical. I got involved with LaRouche and his people back in 1970. And I was studying philosophy and history, and I had very little interest in politics. But I did like the idea of taking over buildings, and so as a member of the Black Student Union, I do that kind of thing. We would do that, maybe we would go play some jazz, afterwards because, some of us were musicians. You're getting paid to go to college back then, it's full scholarship, so what was the problem? No debt. So, that was all good. But LaRouche, or his people initially, and then I met him in 1970, they would say things to you which would be disconcerting, like, well, you say you want to make a revolution, as the phrase used to go, and yet, what are you offering as the alternative to what exists? I mean, if you had power, and you had the ability to change the society, what are you saying you want to do? And this could be really irritating, You get one of these guys, you show up in your room at 11:30 at night, and you have certain romantic inclinations, and they're knocking on the door and talking to you about how the new economy's got to be created. This is not your idea. Really irritating. But at the same time, it was important at the time to really answer this question for some of us. And since I was a philosophy student, I always was interested in something called epistemology, which means how you know what you know. Not the things you know, but how do you know what you know? And why? And can you change the way that you know what you know? Can you make it more perfect? Can you make it better? Is there a faster way, a more efficient way, a more effective way to know how to know something? See, because if you can answer that question, then you don't have to tell people what they need to know. They will discover that for themselves. Matter of fact, that's the only way you ever have a situation where people are not following an ideology. Yeah, see, if it's always a question of so-called information, then it depends on who controls the information. And in what language the information is conveyed. As you know very well here, so I always like to come here. I'm always talking to people, well, they're speaking two languages, at least. So they always know, wait a minute, this is different depending on what language we're using here to convey this so-called information. So the information is not neutral. So how do you determine how one conveys an idea? And is an idea the same thing as information? Suppose it's not. Well, now we're into something interesting, aren't we? Because why? Because now when we start talking about making an alliance with China, which has a completely different way of processing ideas, or Russia, now there's a way to talk about a community of ideation, a community of idea creation, which can become independent, and as if we can actually establish that there is such a thing as epistemology, we could establish a way of thinking about thinking that now means, when it now gets to have to be translated among us all, that those of us who speak utterly different languages but have the same intent can trust one another. Because that's the fundamental problem that you have on the planet. How do I trust the intent of the Chinese? How do I trust the intent of the Americans or anyone else? How do you know you can do that? So the next section, which is about 20 minutes, I want you to follow this carefully. Don't worry whether you're understanding everything it says, because it has a punchline, which I'm putting in here, I need here, to get to at the end. And when we get to that end, I'll be at my conclusion on economic policy, and then we'll take questions. So we'll go now to Jason.
Now, the next section of our webcast is going to feature Jason Ross from the LaRouchePAC basement team. And I'm going to ask him to address a specific question, which he'll have a chance to elaborate a little bit more fully. As our viewers know, Mr. LaRouche has been quite emphatic about the significance of the Chinese lunar program, and especially its vision of mining and exploiting the helium-3 that is on the surface of the moon. And Mr. LaRouche's emphasis has been particularly on the fact that he says this is an embodiment of the spirit of Johannes Kepler. Now, over the course of last weekend, Mr. LaRouche had a expansion of this idea during discussions that he had with members of his team, and he said that what this Chinese lunar program will do will make a unique and useful contribution to the question, what is mankind? So, Jason, I know you've been involved in these discussions with Mr. LaRouche. I would like you to tell us a little bit more about this idea.
All right. Well, there's been some, and this is an ongoing discussion. For example, on Wednesday, on the weekly report or the weekly basement discussion here on the LaRouchePAC site, this was discussed from the standpoint of Vladimir Vernadsky and the ability to look at the human species as a geological force or as a biological force, and how if you examine the characteristics of the human species over historical time, it would seem as though you were observing a different species, that we change in ways that are seen only over evolutionary time in the biosphere itself. What I'm going to take up today is this Keplerian dimension of things. Kepler, the scientist, had put on the table and developed, really created modern science, and he did it in a way where he was very explicit about how he thought about those things and about the resonance, the connection, the similarity between the functioning of our minds and the functioning of the universe as a whole, which not only brought us science, but it brought us a proof of the magnitude of the power of the human mind, of the real magnitude of the human soul. So, to address this question, how does Kepler give us an answer to what is mankind? LaRouche said, take two approaches to this. The classical approach of what Kepler had done in his day, and then also take the modern approach and how China is embodying this with their work at present. So first, the classical part of things. Kepler used a technique that was developed by Nicholas of Cusa, a technique that Cusa called the coincidence of opposites. And he used this to develop a new language for science, for astronomy in particular, and to break through the Aristotelian way of thinking, which was based on logic, on syllogisms, frankly on words, on playing with words, categories that concepts are defined in, how phrases, logical phrases come together, and it was not based on letting nature itself speak. One particular tenet of Aristotle that Cusa and Kepler demolished was Aristotle's conception that you can't have both A and not A. This is something that Ayn Rand also gets very excited about. I guess that's an aside. So you got Aristotle, you can't have both A and not A. There are not contradictions. True knowledge is an avoidance of contradiction. That's how you know that you're right. Cusa gave examples of how that's actually not how to be right. It's certainly not how to discover anything. So Cusa distinguished between the world of the senses, the rational level of understanding based upon those senses, and a higher intellectual level of understanding that was reached only by contradictions among those senses. As an example of this, we can take how Cusa uses the infinite in Book 1 of his work called On Learned Ignorance, Didacta Ignorantia. There, Cusa uses geometrical analogies extended to the infinite to give a way for his reader to understand what his conception of God is as a specific lack of knowledge. We're going to be hearing more about that, a specific kind of lack of knowledge, a learned ignorance, a specific kind of ignorance is itself a form of knowledge for Cusa. How could that be? He gives some examples. He says, one thing, in the infinite, a circle and a line no longer oppose each other. They aren't really different shapes anymore when you take these concepts and extend them to the infinite. This is a way of making a point about the infinite, even though obviously a circle and a line are easily differentiated when they're of a finite size. He says that God is the type of maximum to which nothing is opposed, not even the minimum. How can you have a maximum that's not opposite to a minimum? What kind of maximum is that? He says that we would attain a shadow of this vision of God by consideration of ways in which our understanding failed to reach him, by developing a specific shape of the ineffable, by knowing in what way it was ineffable, by what way specific contradictions in thought could be created to get at it. That's really only a shadow of what Cusa does. People who've read it, it's a tough thing to try to summarize briefly. Partly because his whole work is a constant challenge to your thinking and not adding things to your thought. This act of thinking, this discovery process that he enlivens in the mind, is itself the way to an understanding of God in his view. Now, in Book 2 of this work, of On Learned Ignorance, Cusa takes up the universe, the created world. And he does this by looking at how the universe itself defies logic and defies understanding based on sense perception, based on the senses. One consideration that he uses is that there is no perfection in the created world, in the universe, including no equality. He says there is only true equality in God. We won't find it in the universe itself. And that would mean that such things as a perfect circle, although you can imagine it geometrically, could never actually exist. For an actual circle to exist, each point on the circle would have to be exactly the same distance from the center. And Cusa says, how could it be that they're so equally the same distance from the center, these points, that they couldn't have been made more equal? He says you can't have two lines that are actually exactly the same length. That concept involves an impossibility. Equality itself could not be embodied in a line. Or in motion. Cusa says that two motions couldn't be identical either. How could two moments of motion be so alike that they couldn't have been made somewhat more alike? So from these considerations, Cusa comes to conclusions about astronomy that weren't actually shown to be true for quite some time. For example, he says that there is no way to have circles in anything, including in astronomy. No planet could move in a circle. Circles couldn't exist because they involve that absolute equality. He also said there could be no absolute equality of motion. There could not be uniform motion, because that would again call on this equality that could not exist in the universe. So, in a world dominated by an Aristotelian outlook, which said that although the earth might be changeable, the heavens are static, they're perfect in their stasis, in their staying the same, the heavens are perfect in their geometrical existence, they're perfect, God traced them out with a compass and a ruler. Cusa says, no, it actually can't be like that. It's impossible. And that these concepts will not be able to be the guiding understanding behind astronomy. He was way ahead of his day on this. Now, to say something about, to get into Kepler, we have to have some background on what astronomy is, on how it got to the state it was by the time Kepler hit the scene around the year 1600. So, among the stars in the sky, there are some which move. There's also obviously the sun and the moon, which move quite a bit, but also some stars themselves move over time. That although almost every star stays in place from night to night if you go out and look at them, you find some that are moving stars, wandering stars. The planets called these stars wanderers. The Greek word wanderer gives us the English word planet. That's where the word comes from. So let's take a look. We see in this video here a type of motion that these stars might make. So here you've got, let's say, Mars, and we're watching it move. This is sped up over years and years. Every couple of years, Mars moves backwards. You have to imagine against that background that we have all the constellations, Cancer, Leo, all the other ones. And so Mars moves mostly in one direction, but also goes backwards. It only goes backwards when it's opposite the Sun. That is, when it's in the constellation that's at its peak at midnight. Mars always moves quickly when it's near the Sun, when we see it at dawn or at dusk, backwards when it's at its peak at midnight. And you can see that these retrogressions, these going backwards, they have different sizes and different parts of the orbit. So Mars has a backwards motion, which is somehow tied to the position of the Sun. It also has some parts of its orbit where it seems to overall move faster, and some parts where it overall seems to move slower. So how to explain that? That's a difficult thing. So Claudius Ptolemy, you may have heard of, Ptolemy, 2,000 years ago, he had written a book, the Syntaxis, also known as the Almagest. He wrote a book where he explained how the planets moved, sort of. He explained how that dot in the sky would move, at least, although he didn't claim to know anything about what was physically happening. The way he did it was he used 2 circles for each planet. So each planet would overall move on a circle through all the stars, through all of the constellations, and on that circle would be a second smaller circle that spun more rapidly and would cause, by their combined motions, Mars or any other planet to sometimes get pulled backwards, to have these backwards motions. The other aspect of things was to explain the fact that overall there's a part of Mars's orbit where those retrogressions are shorter, and there's another part of the orbit where they're longer and they occur more commonly. To explain this, Ptolemy used the second thing that Cusa proved couldn't exist. He used a certain kind of uniform motion. So what he did was, and we'll see that in this video you see here, that instead of having the Mars simply move around the Earth, this is ignoring the second circle upon it, he first tried moving the center of Mars's orbit off to the side. And that helped somewhat. And then you see the motion there. He put the center of Mars's orbit in between the Earth and the point on the right around which Mars moves at a constant speed. That point on the right is called the equant. That was a difficult thing to take in. Let's watch that one more time. So you can see how the retrogressions would look if Mars simply moved uniformly. Here, we move it off-center. The retrogressions are in the right spot, but the lengths are long. One more adjustment. We separate the center of position and the center of motion, and Ptolemy matches the observations pretty well. And that was his goal, to match the observations. So that point on the right is called the equant point. We'll come back to that with Kepler. So we've got a circle, which Cusa doesn't accept, and we've got uniform angular motion around another point, which Cusa wouldn't accept. Ptolemy was, a millennium and a half before Cusa. Then there's Copernicus, Nicholas Copernicus, who I'm sure everybody's heard of, who had the planets move around the sun, or more accurately, had the sun stand in the middle of the moving planets. And he actually had more circles in a certain way than Ptolemy. He had the planets move on a circle, on a circle, on a circle, around a point near the sun. That was how Copernicus explained the motion of the planets. And the goals of these guys, it was to accurately predict where you'd see a dot in the sky. It wasn't a physical theory. Physics didn't really have anything to do with the heavens. So this is where Kepler comes into things. And Kepler, he was a follower of Cusa, and he was convinced ever since his youth, as he was in school, he wrote a school essay on this topic, that the planets, they do go around the sun, but not in the way Copernicus did. Not that the planets are moving and the sun's sitting in the middle watching them, but that they went around the sun because the sun was the cause of their motions, a physical hypothesis. that the sun physically caused the motions, not God with a compass and a ruler. So in one of his very major works called The New Astronomy, Kepler used Cousé's technique of the coincidence of opposites in a specific way to lead to a higher truth, to force people to consider, and he then demonstrated his physical concept. He did this through what's called the vicarious hypothesis. In this, Kepler asked one question, and he got multiple different answers. He got contradictory answers. Would he then try to simply avoid the contradiction, or would he use the contradiction? He used it. So let's get into this. The question that Kepler asked that got multiple different responses was, how far away is the center of Mars's orbit from the Sun? What's that distance? Well, he answered the question twice by using two different aspects of observations, longitude and latitude. Longitude is the motion of the planet overall around the stars through the constellations. Latitude is the motion above or below the central line called the ecliptic, which goes through all of the constellations of the zodiac. So when he creates his vicarious hypothesis, Kepler uses those assumptions of his predecessors, the circle, the equant, geometry, mathematics. He uses them to create a new model, better than anything anyone had seen before. It worked incredibly well. It was based on the real sun for the first time ever. The actual sun itself was the center and cause of planetary motions, which were still then made by circles and uniform motion. That worked great. It gave a distance between the sun and the center of Mars's orbit. In this video, we'll see how he used a different kind of observation to get another answer. So here again, you've got longitude, the motion of Mars around the ecliptic through the signs of the zodiac. Latitude would be Mars's motion above or below the ecliptic. By using some clever trigonometry, Kepler used the fact that Mars goes above and below this plane of the Earth around the Sun. And by solving for some triangles, he was able to figure out all of the distances that you see here. Meaning he was able to get that distance in the middle. How far away is the center of Mars's orbit from the Sun? He got this green length. Now, there was one trouble. That green length was not the same length that he had gotten before. It wasn't the length that he had in the vicarious hypothesis. So in this next video, we'll take a look at a comparison between the two. What we're going to see is how, when Kepler adjusts the vicarious hypothesis to use this length, which came from latitudes, a problem arises. And this problem was key in his work to reform and develop a new astronomy. So we have that green length here, and if you can see it, there's another purple length. Oh, okay. So what you see here are two different places where Mars's center of its orbit could be. The orange one is based on latitudes. The red one is based on longitudes. The difference between where these models say that Mars will be is 8 minutes. A minute is a 60th of a degree, just like it's a 60th of an hour in time. So, to say that again, Kepler created a model using longitudes. It worked great. It included a distance that was in doubt, that was derived indirectly. He then used latitudes in that model that you saw with Mars coming up and out of the plane to get its distance more directly. That new distance, which was indicated in green, doesn't work with the other one. If he adjusted his vicarious hypothesis to have that green distance, it broke. So he got two contradictory answers. Either the distance is the green distance or the purple distance. it would either be the orange center or the red center here. Those are two different distances. And they're also two different positions. Is Mars seen along that red dashed line or along the yellow dashed line? Well, you can't have it both ways on either of them. You can't have two different distances. You can't have two different positions. And what the data showed was opposite for each. The longitude data suggested one direction. The latitude data suggested one position of that center. So we have two different answers here. What does this mean? Well, both answers can't be right. They preclude each other. When you have one, you lose the other one. And Kepler says that this 8 minutes difference is the key to a reformation of astronomy, a key to a whole new approach to things. So what he concludes is that this proves that the approach was wrong, that trying to explain things from the standpoint of the senses, of motion itself, wouldn't do. We had to bring in a physical cause for why the planets moved the way that they did, going beyond the senses. We have to find a unifying conception under which the contradictions would no longer exist. Kepler did that. He made a physical astronomy. He explained how the sun would cause the motions of the planets. He had only one measure for that distance between the sun and the center of Mars's orbit. He had only one position that Mars would be, and it was right. And he forced people to break out of that Aristotelian view and bring physics out into the heavens, to make cause the reason for why things are, and he used a contradiction to create that new thought. While Cusa showed that a shape couldn't be the same over time or a cause, or that equal motion itself couldn't be a cause, a principle, which is always equal to itself, that's a different kind of thing. A relationship between the planet's distance from the sun and its speed, that's a different kind of thing. And that's what Kepler had done. Yes, he did say that planets moved in ellipses, but the ellipse was a result, in his view, of two different powers acting on the planets. One moving them around the sun, one causing them to come closer and farther from it. So the ellipse, Kepler's ellipse, was not a shape, like Copernicus's circles. It was a result of a physical process. So that was, I'm aware that that was rather in-depth, and that might not have all been understood. I can refer people to both the science.larouchepac.com site for more on this, as well as the video called Metaphor and Intermezzo, and we'll have links after the show in the video description on YouTube for that. So when multiple opposing answers all seem equally appropriate or inappropriate, that indicates that the language we are using lacks the ability to actually comprehend the topic we're looking at. That's the Cusan approach of metaphor employed by Kepler. That wasn't the last example of it. Let me give a few examples of some other questions that have multiple answers that are equally right or equally wrong, however you want to look at it. So, how would you answer this question if I were to ask you, how many sides does a circle have? You might have an answer you're thinking of right now, whatever that answer might be. Try to think of another answer that somebody else might give. Compare those two answers. Your answer, a second answer. Do you think you could determine who was right and who was wrong? You might even have a third friend with a third answer. I asked this to a group a couple weeks ago, and I got three answers. One side is just one curved side. Infinite sides, a circle's like a polygon with an infinite number of sides. Or zero sides, because sides are flat and a circle's not flat. Now, I think you could spend a long time arguing over those three answers and who was right. I think the point to take from it is that there's something wrong with the question. There's something about asking how many sides does a circle have, which is inherently a weird question. Here's another one. Let's go to the idea of eureka. So eureka, this use of this phrase eureka, I have found it. This goes back to Archimedes, who was, while taking a bath, figured out how to solve a problem of a possibly counterfeit's not the right word, a dishonestly alloyed crown. So there was a crown or some piece of gold made for a ruler, and he thought that maybe there was actually silver mixed into it, that it wasn't pure gold. He asked, said, Archimedes, can you figure this one out? So Archimedes was, it was his task, a job for him. The story goes he got into a bathtub. As he hopped in, the water rose up over the sides because of his body in it. And he says, eureka, I found it. By putting the crown in water, he could measure its volume by seeing how much the water level moved. If he knew the volume of the crown, and he knew how much it weighed, he could get its density. Now, I looked up some modern-day measurements of the density of gold, 19.3 grams per cubic centimeter, and silver, 10.5 grams per cubic centimeter. So if you found out what the density of the crown was, and it wasn't 19.3, but it was a lower number, that would mean that it had that much silver in it, mixed with the gold, and you could actually find out if the goldsmith was cheating you or not. So that's an interesting story. So those numbers I gave for gold and silver, the densities of it, what if I were to ask, what's the density of carbon? Carbon's an element, like gold or like silver. Why don't you try, I'm going to leave this one as a puzzle. Make a note to it, look up yourself on the internet, see if you can figure out what the density of carbon is, and see if you run into any troubles with that.
What I draw out of that is specifically this end point is made. And to do that, I'm going to refer to something that happened in New York. The end of our meeting down there was the meeting that we did, which was in honor of Martin Luther King. And someone had asked the question to Helga LaRouche. And she gave this answer, and I just think I can say, use the first part of it. And she says this: there is one area which we have not really talked about enough today. And that is what we need urgently to have we need urgently to have a new cultural renaissance on the whole globe. I think that we all agree, and it was expressed by Ramsey Clark, that the popular culture is horrible. It turns people into beasts. Oh, actually, beasts are not like that. I don't know of any beast which is as bestial as human beings sometimes become. So what we need urgently is a renaissance. How do we get out of a dark age and into a renaissance? We have studied the universal history of civilization. And the question is, how did mankind get to the golden age of the Italian Renaissance, which was an absolute break with the entire axioms of witchcraft, flagellance, and the Dark Age? She goes on, she says other things. And what was done then? Civilization was saved by a handful of people going back to the high points of previous civilizations, to the Greek classical period, to Dante, to Petrarca. And they started to revive the ancient treasures of the past, and the method of collecting handwriting and original humanist writings is absolutely key. So my first advice is to throw out all books with footnotes, or at least put them in the basement for the time being, and go back to the original sources. Go back to Plato, go back to Augustine, St. Augustine, go back to Confucius, read other great thinkers of other cultures. Stop right there on that. Okay, now, the issue here of what Jason showed is that was the product of a 10-year project that was taken up by Jason and some of his associates when he was 18 years old. It was assigned to them by LaRouche at the time. They became something which you sometimes may have heard us refer to as called the basement team. What they did was they took the original writings of Johannes Kepler and they worked through them paragraph by paragraph in teams. And then what they did was they posted those results on the internet. And they did this over an arc of time. And at one point, they ended up, though they never planned this, in a dialogue with some of the scientists from NASA, who then posted part of their deliberations on the NASA website. Now, this was never our intention. What we were just doing was trying to give them a way of discovering the method of discovery. Because one of the things about Johannes Kepler, which is particularly useful in his book, for example, Mysterium Cosmographicum, The Mystery of the Cosmos, he has the way it's written is he wrote it when he was in his 20s, but then he went back and looked at it again when he was about 20 years older. and he has footnotes about all the things that are wrong in what he thought when he was in his 20s. So the book is itself an hypothesis about how to understand what we call the solar system, but then the book also comments on the mistakes that he made in his looking at that issue. So the book isn't just about how to think about the physical solar system, but it's a book about how to correct how you think about it after you've thought about it. Now, what's important here is this. You notice that what Jason kept saying is that Kepler introduced physics. That these other people, Copernicus, Ptolemy, and others, were actually theorizing about something they were seeing. Kepler recognized that what he was seeing was false. Because what you see is false. Because it's only a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that admits itself to your visual apparatus. Right? If you were a fly, you would see completely different. Matter of fact, you would see in multiple images. The same is true of your hearing. If you were a dog or a cat, and cats are superior to dogs on this account, some of us like cats more, they hear things you can't hear. That doesn't mean that your hearing is invalid per se, but it means that your hearing is not all that can be heard. In John Keats's poem, Ode to a Grecian Urn, he says, "Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter." So the concept here, and this is important to just point out in another element here, is that maybe the way in which science must work is that it is the discovery of the invisible, the ability to see the invisible, the unseen, and to hear the unheard. And we're not talking here about things that are done by the means of brainwashing. Let's take, for example, this is a known principle, that's why I bring it up, something that Aldous Huxley once said. I think I used this here before once, but I think I should just refer to it here. It's a quote from Aldous Huxley. Some of you know he was a writer, British writer, lived in California for the last part of his life, and he wrote the book, Brave New World. Well, in 1961, he gave a lecture. Actually, it was broadcast by Voice of America at the time, and it was done in California at the University of California Medical School. Or California Medical School, not University of California. Here was his quote. This is 1961. He said this: "There will be, in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and produce dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution." So this is important because I'm not talking about the extension of perception or the manipulation of perception. I'm talking about something completely different. However, what's important to recognize is that the thing that we are discussing here concerning Kepler, from, quote, our side, is also discussed from the other side as well. Because if you can control and open and close the doors of perception, then you can also control and open and close the doors of delusion. You do both. Okay, now, therefore, what is the relevance of, or the significance of, the BRICS process, the economic development process? And I'll just show you this report, just so you scene in case you haven't seen it. This is the product of our organization over the past year. Those that remain from the old core of what LaRouche established back in the 1970s, augmented by a number of people like Jason, who joined about 10 years ago, and sort of advanced the work in a completely different direction. It's called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge. What this is our new intervention coming off what we did in 1993 to 96. I told you we invented or created the policy that got adopted by the Chinese government. Not that we had the only idea about it. They had their own ideas. And Russia had its own ideas, and many other places had their own ideas. But our job was different. Our job was to try to advance this process now to the next stage. And the World Land Bridge is that stage. Now, this is not a transportation system. It's also that. What this idea is that these are called development corridors. That in human history, and in the evolution of species, what happens is that life tends to live along coasts. Matter of fact, originally, life came out of the oceans, often carrying its own water with it, to the degree it could, until it was able to help elicit or create precipitation on land. But what has generally happened in the history of the human race, if you look in general, life exists along water systems, along coastlines or along riverbeds. But that does not have to be the case. You can also develop the interiors of continents, and you can move water around on the planet. You can create situations in terms of, for example, climate change. Just taking this up for a minute. You can temper the planet. That is to say, there's a general weather and climate system which exists, which is called the biosphere. And there are ways to induce the biosphere to reproduce various conditions in different parts of the planet. People have tended to talk about this as something called weather modification. That's a very crude kind of thing. You can do something else which is not, sounds almost as crude, but something as simple as planting trees properly, but in the billions, shapes and changes the climate and tempers it in various ways. Now, I'm not going to get more into that detail, but I want to say something about what the idea of the land bridge is. The idea is to create development corridors that you no longer have merely cities along coastlines, and you create situations like that around, let's say, Bangladesh, where you do have an overpopulation in that particular area and you have extensive flooding and stuff like that. You don't have to have that. You can have cities of 800,000 people, 500,000 people, whatever, in the interiors of continents. And what you can begin to do is to reshape and reconfigure the geometry of the surface of the Earth. Now remember, we don't really have much of an idea of what goes on in the interior of the Earth at all. I mean, we've gone down approximately 8-9 kilometers, roughly. We have no idea what's going on at the center of the Earth, and the notion of all the models that you've seen before about this sort of, really hard center or some kind of massive nuclear explosion going in, we have no idea what's there. So we're not even talking about the exploration of inner Earth, of inner space. We're just talking about the idea of reconfiguring the surface of the globe. Now, why is this relevant? In the Malthusian population control theory, there are too many people on the planet. Except there's a problem if you ever take the time to actually look at population density. If you take the city of Paris, many of you I think have been there, ask yourself the question, has Paris, if you've been there, struck you as being like teeming with people that like just really got to be moved around? If it hasn't, let me just indicate to you that if you take the state of Texas, the state of Louisiana, the state of Mississippi, and the state of Alabama, you can, if you reproduce in that area, just those 4 states in the United States, the population density of Paris, you can put everybody in the planet on those 4 states.
What happens when they all starve to death?
That is even more interesting because what we have seen happen since, for example, the American farmer of 1776, when approximately over 90% of the American population were agricultural. What has occurred is that now, well, let's take 1980, because of course a lot of farmers have been eliminated through Monsanto, other things like that. But at that time, we had 3% of the population producing food for a population, originally the population was 3.5 million. Population was approximately 290 million. So in other words, what had happened was that we had gone from a situation where 90% of our people had to produce the food to for 3 million, to a situation where 3% of the people were producing the food for nearly 300 million. Now there's a reason for that. And it's important to say what those reasons are because they're not taught. Now we get into concepts that have been completely kept away from people, which LaRouche in particular was the spokesperson for, and I'll say something about this. This involves something called energy throughput, energy density, productivity, capital intensity. Now those are a lot of terms I just used, and because of the nature of the limits of this, I'll only refer to these. But the key invention of what's called the science of physical economy is taking up exactly the question that was just asked. How is it possible to increase the density of energy throughput so that you can create a situation where more people are capable of living with less anxiety, tension, and destruction on smaller amounts of land surface at a higher living standard? This is called multiple and multiply connected optimizing criteria. It's completely missing from any discussion of economics that ever goes on, because all discussions of economics are sort of like Ptolemy and Copernicus. They are discussions of numbers and statistics and money, rather than discussions of physical change and improvement. So for example, I didn't say that it was desirable to put everybody on Earth in 4 states of the United States. And if you've ever been to Texas, you might know why. I don't like Texas personally. I don't mind some of the people I've met, but it's not like I have a great ambition to go to Texas. Nor do I think a lot of people in a place like China have a great ambition to go to Texas. I'm simply indicating that the ideas of population, overpopulation, are actually simply not only erroneous, but they are ideological. There is a different idea, if you want to talk to me about it, which is what is a productive living standard in concert with some sort of establishment of harmony with nature. Yeah, we can talk about that all day. But the notion that there are too many people in the world not only is false, it was never believed by the people that invented it. It was believed by the people that adopted it. But it wasn't believed by the people that invented it. It was actually first invented not by Malthus. It was invented in response to Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, when he was 23 years old in 1728-29, wrote an essay called The Necessity for Paper Currency. And he was arguing that still America then, wasn't the United States, it was America, was capable, the 13 colonies, were capable of producing as much food as all of Europe combined. And that if a paper currency were developed, it was possible for the value that was otherwise being shifted by means of barter to be symbolized by this paper currency, and this would allow for credit to be established for the farmers and for the productive people who were involved in manufacturing. That was very early, still in America at the time. And an Italian priest by the name of Gian Maria del Ortes, O-R-T-E-S, reacted to this and responded to this by talking about how the idea of human beings teeming over the planet in a post-American, massively developed agriculture was a sort of sin against God. So remember that Thomas Malthus was a parson. He was a religious figure. And his notion was that population should not be controlled. He didn't believe in birth control. Very important to understand. Thomas Malthus did not believe in birth control. Thomas Malthus believed in nature and nature controlling population. So he also didn't believe in hospitals. He also didn't believe in sanitation. That's what he said. No, if you have people and they're poor and they have a lot of babies, there's no problem. Just make sure that you're not artificially creating an artificial environment in which they survive. If you don't do that, everything will be fine. So you pass laws against maintaining low corn prices or things like that. You can't have any regulation of what's called supply and demand. If you do that, everything will take care of itself. And what's called liberal economics sort of evolved from that. But I wanted to say this in conclusion. As I said, I would come to that, and I see people have questions, so we'll go to those. The idea is that those problems that have been referred to, such as pollution, or overpopulation, or war, are products of the adolescence of humanity. These things are products of the inability of the human race to collaborate in the kind of way that the BRICS nations, and specifically the way that someone like Vladimir Putin of Russia has attempted to address the United States over basically the period since 1999. There's a lot of discussions about the issue of Putin and what he represents and what he is and so forth and so on. In part, that's a distinctly American, or excuse me, Anglo-American trait, because in other words, understanding governments can only be done by understanding a personality, as opposed to recognizing that there's an actual Russian establishment. I mean, they're just like the thing with Barack Obama, as though there were a Barack Obama that is actually making policy, which I find an interesting exercise in absurdity, which is one we can like just deconstruct that in a couple of minutes here and easy to do. But the idea that there's a demand, a psychological demand to believe that, you see, that's the interesting question concerning the war for the mind, what's called the empire of the mind. You remember I referenced before Winston Churchill. And I didn't talk about, I want to conclude with this, Winston Churchill's discussions with Franklin Roosevelt at the time of the Atlantic Charter, in which Franklin Roosevelt made Winston Churchill aware that when the United States entered the Second World War, that its intent would be to eliminate the 17th century outlook and methods of the British Empire, and the Dutch Empire, and the Belgian Empire, and the Portuguese Empire, and the French Empire. And Roosevelt was apoplectic about that. I mean, Churchill was apoplectic about that. He was really, really upset. Very upset. And the history of the period of the last 70 years, which will be commemorated this year with the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, was that FDR, Roosevelt, died and Churchill did not. Churchill was here until the early 60s. And as a representative of British imperial policy, he made sure that the world of 19th century imperialism and colonialism, and the world of the 18th century that his ancestor, Lord Churchill, had implemented with Lord Palmerston through the British East India Company, that those worlds were maintained. That's what they did. And they won over, or created, this vertical United States in the aftermath, particularly of Eisenhower, inclusive of the Kennedy assassination in particular. And the United States represents the policy of what's used to be referred to as the English-speaking Union, together with Britain, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. The English-speaking Union in the 1920s, that's what you're looking at. It's a colonial enterprise. It's what Snowden calls, and what Snowden calls the Five Eyes. Some of you have heard that term. That's what he's talking about. Canada, America, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. It's that, and that outlook, an imperial outlook of the 19th, 20th century, and back to the 17th century. That outlook will doom everyone. Or another outlook will emerge, a 21st century outlook, and even 22nd century outlook, actually, which is the one that the BRICS nations represent, and what is required for the transatlantic world to be brought into conjunction with that is this return to the sources that Mrs. LaRouche talked about. And in this case, the true sources of the American Revolution. Alexander Hamilton being the leader of that. I haven't said much about him, but I'll do that in questions and answers. I'll just point out that the American Revolution of Alexander Hamilton established independent, sovereign credit institutions, monetary policy, and production policy, which was intended to eliminate the plantation system of North America in favor of a manufacturing system. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was intended to maintain that plantation system. And the key factor in that plantation system, which is still a contemporary factor, was the development of mass drug culture and pharmacological methods through designer drugs of creating an empire of the mind. And that, combined with the cyber and related techniques, are the means for the maintenance of that empire. To overthrow it, simply necessary to join with the BRICS nations, rediscover Alexander Hamilton, return the United States to its actual revolutionary tradition, and create a world based on the notion of a strategic defense of the earth, which allows for the highest achievements of human civilization to now be placed in the context of individual freedom of a type that we haven't seen before in human history. In that respect, internet and these other things are very useful. In that respect, a whole new generation that no longer has to be beholden to obsolete institutions, but can create cross-cultural and cross-continental instantaneous political action. Yeah, that gives us not only hope, but it gives us a way to change a future that need not be controlled by monolithic powers or by money. And this is the future should you choose it. And that's the deal we're offering you here today. Okay, thank you. Practice has been for decades to never worry about things you can't do anything about, but rather correct and fix things that you can both control or influence. That's always how we've operated. And that's why we have successfully, on several occasions, despite the fact that we were told that it was impossible to do so, made policy for nations. Now, that doesn't often happen by our being acknowledged as being the good guys in making policy. For example, we tried to make policy for the Soviet Union, or with the Soviet Union, back in 1981 and 82, and they refused. At that time, we were trying to tell them that there was the only way that you could possibly stop nuclear war is that you had to supersede the technology of nuclear weapons, and you had to do that jointly with the United States to create a form of technology that could render those weapons impotent and obsolete. That is to say, so that I can be very clear about this, you will never reduce the world's nuclear weapons stockpile to an acceptable level, including if you reduce it to 1% of its present level. If you got rid of 99% of the nuclear weapons in the world, all that would do is reduce your nuclear exchange to the equivalent of a nuclear winter, in which basically everybody on the planet would either freeze to death or starve to death. Who was left after the exchange? I mean, that's the best you can do. That's if you get rid of 99% of the weapons. And, of course, what we've seen since the time that we were having this discussion with the Russians, which was actually 33 years ago, we've had a refinement of nuclear weapons. They become more lethal, more precise, and more quick start. We've had a lessening of the nuclear window. So you'll never get past it. What you have to do is to supersede the technology. No weapon in human history which has been created has ever not been used. There's no way to create a situation in which that weapon were not used except to supersede the technology. So I reference this because what happened was that the Soviet Union said no. And this was in the period of January of 1983. And this was an indirect discussion. Let me be very explicit about this. This was a set of discussions that Lyndon LaRouche was personally carrying out with a representative of the Russian government, Soviet Union government, by the name of Sherzhnev. He was the Russian ambassador to the United States, assigned to Washington. We also had contacts at the United Nations at the time. And these negotiations had gone on for over a year. And for reasons we won't go through here, they refused. We told them at the time, if you refuse this, within 5 years, your nation will cease to exist, or may cease to exist. Now, we didn't mean by that what happened was going to happen in the way it did. Lyndon LaRouche did not know that. He was simply saying that the trajectory that the Soviet Union was on at that time meant that in a designated, knowable period of time, it would cease to exist. And part of the reason for that is that over 60% of all of the domestic product of that nation was deployed within its military. Today, over 65% of all of the domestic product of the United States is deployed within its military. The United States will cease to exist within a 5-year period if it does not change its policies. This is important for you to know as an assertion. You don't have to agree with it, but you have to understand that the world we've entered is knowable, it is changeable, but it is not avoidable. It is knowable, it is changeable, but it is not avoidable. So when I talk about my deal of 6 months, which is a pretty good deal, I'm doing that
Committee for the Republic of Canada. And today's conference is in a series of conferences we've had and we will continue to have till we achieve our goal. I just want to make a few opening remarks before introducing Dennis and before he gives his presentation. What I want to say is that we are at a point where we are witnessing profound changes in the world. And the recent stunning, the recent, the best example is the recent stunning, powerful, total repudiation, cancellation of the murderous policies in Greece, with the near landslide victory of the Syriza party and the independent Greek parties. This is the best example of people's outpouring, coming into the streets and rejecting the oligarchical system and standing up for the dignity of man. This is again a reflection of what is happening, what has already happened with half of humanity in terms of the BRICS nations. And this is something that my organization, Dennis LaRouche, is at the center of. Because some of the people, the present government of Greece, are not only aware of our role worldwide, our historic role in shaping the present situation, but many of them have also been in contact with us, and some of them have spoken at our conferences, such conferences in the past, and have actually organized with us on the issues of Glass-Steagall and protecting the dignity of the population. And what you have right now, today, you will hear from Dennis Speedy, who has been a collaborator of LaRouche in this process for the past 4 years. And is central to what among our organization is known as the Manhattan Project. Because Manhattan has been the battleground between forces, the American patriotic forces, and the imperial British forces who have sought to destroy the America. And over the past recent month, the whole political topography of Manhattan has been severely shifted by what we have done, by deploying young people into the streets, into organizations, and by holding conferences with other institutions in Manhattan. And this fight has been centrally to get the United States to break with the empire and join the BRICS. Because if we don't do that today, we don't do that right now, we are looking at a thermonuclear war possibility, a confrontation between the United States, Russia, and China on the other side. So our intention is to get people here to mobilize with us into that process, into discovering the real soul of not just the United States, but also civilization per se, which the Greek people have discovered. And Manhattan is very important, I'll just make a few words, because this has been the home of leading American patriots, like Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, and the founder of what we know as the American credit system, or the American system of political economy. It's also the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose birthday was yesterday, which we celebrate today. So with that in mind, with these thoughts in mind, I'd like to introduce Dennis Speedy.
Well, since I come from the United States, and despite myself, am affected by the cultural and commercial characteristics of the United States, I will first offer you all a deal. Americans always have deals. It goes like this. In the United States, whenever the presidential elections come around, people are encouraged to take as much as a year of their lives to elect some character in a certain context, because I don't believe in being afraid. Or let's put it a little bit differently. I don't believe in being terrified. Being afraid is fine. See, but terrified is different. See, only a fool is not afraid when confronted with true danger. Matter of fact, that's how you get mobilized to do something about it. But if you're terrified, then you're paralyzed. Greece is interesting because the defense minister of Greece, now defense minister, the new defense minister, spoke at our Schiller Institute conference in Germany a few months back. And I reference that because the party that won the election, the Syriza party, 6 years ago, got only 3% of the vote in that country. They had something like, I think, 6 people in the parliament. This time, in these elections, they received 37% of the vote. They have 149 seats. And they have a corresponding independent Greek party, of which the defense minister is a member, which received another approximately 13 seats. So what's relevant about our friend Mr. Komnenos, who came to our meeting in Germany, is that he also came to the United States and he was there to organize with our people at the Congress to reinstate Franklin Roosevelt's Glass-Steagall policy. In that name, I mean, that's what he was talking about. And he's talking about that now with the economics minister, the finance minister of Greece today. These people have the policy of implementing what Franklin Roosevelt did. It was mentioned that yesterday was his birthday, so let's just say something about what Franklin Roosevelt did within 24 hours of being inaugurated President of the United States. What happened was, he was inaugurated on March 4th, giving a famous speech in which he said at the time that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes. That is what we cannot tolerate. Fear is fine, but not terror. And what had happened to the country was that the country, the United States then, had been terrorized by the Great Depression, the failure of the stock market in October of 1929, and then a series of years of ratcheting down of the living standards of the population, with a president who refused to act on behalf of the general welfare of the people of the United States or the people of the world for that matter. And so Roosevelt, who had known something about conquering fear himself because he had contracted polio, he was paralyzed, he was shriveled from the waist down, and he had never publicly admitted that he had that disease. Matter of fact, he always made it appear that he could walk, although he could not. The way he did this was he did this together with his son, James, who would always accompany him, and he created this way of sort of dancing on the top of his body, very powerful upper torso. And he would lean forward, basically, back and forth, so he gave the illusion to make it look like he could walk. He'd been told that he had to stay out of politics, that he could never go back into politics. And together with his wife, Eleanor, and his advisor, Louis Howe, he had defied that, become governor of New York and then president of the United States. Roosevelt did not go to the inaugural ball that night. Perhaps he had been awakened because of the fact that about 2 weeks before he got to the White House, he'd almost been killed in Florida when an assassin had shot but missed him because a woman in the crowd deflected his arm. And instead, the mayor of Chicago was killed. He wasn't killed immediately or instantaneously. He died about a month later, Mayor Cermak of Chicago. So he was shot instead, and Roosevelt was missed. So perhaps Franklin Roosevelt thought, I better not go to the inauguration because I don't have any time to lose. And what he did was, sometime about 2 a.m., between midnight and 2 a.m., he called a meeting, and this is on Saturday, to become President of the United States. I say some character because recently we haven't had qualified people running for that office. When I say recently, I mean the last 40 years approximately. Which is relatively recent for some of us, such as myself, who've been doing this for this long. But in this case, I'm going to make a deal with you. All idea is that you and those who may come in the course of the next hour and a half should, we urge you, make a deal with us that for the next 6 months, you throw yourself together with us completely into a process of doing two things at once. Preventing what could be, as they say, a complete wipeout, including of human civilization. But secondly, more usefully, positively, creating what could be the most dramatic change in a short period of time in human history that would have happened in the world, certainly since 1989 at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and maybe the most profound change in human history since approximately 1347 to 1350, about roughly almost 700 years ago. Now, so here's what's up. There has been, as was already said, a dramatic shift in the world. It started in 2013, 2 years ago, when the president of China, in the course of having a discussion with various nations, made it clear that he was committed, and that nation was committed, to what he referred to as a New Silk Road policy. The New Silk Road it's not the Silk Road that people may be familiar with, the Bitcoin version. No, this is not the 2-Bitcoin version of Silk Road. This is the real one. This is a policy outlook that had been co-developed with the Chinese government by our organization between 1993 and 1996. It was then secret and became manifest in public in 1996 at a conference in Beijing, where the founder of the Schiller Institute and the wife of Linda LaRouche, Helga LaRouche, gave a keynote presentation at that time. There were 37 nations that were present, and out of that conference came what was called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And then a process began between 1997 and now, which had a lot of twists and turns, and there were a lot of setbacks. But that process resulted in the period of 2013 in the summer of President Xi Jinping announcing that his nation was committed to this policy. Immediately subsequent to that discussion, he visited Indonesia and Thailand. And on the occasion of that visit, particularly to Indonesia, he announced the creation of what he called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now this is important because this was the beginning of the announcement of several such banking institutions, all of which had one objective and would then be actualized or activated in a different way this past July 17th, 2014, in Fortaleza, Brazil. On the occasion of the Fortaleza Conference, which happened and included also the nation of Argentina, at that point, it became clear that a new regime, a new alternative for the planet had crystallized, and crystallized in the form of the nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and also Argentina. Now the Argentinian addition was very important because Argentina had just been engaged in a repudiation of the United States' court system asserting that Argentina must pay an unjust debt to a set of American hedge fund traders who were demanding a 1,600% return on their actual investment, as they call it. They had purchased a portion of Argentinian debt at a discount and they had gone to the courts in New York in particular to demand full payment. And the Argentinians said no, because you are saying that you want payment on the so-called leveraged value of your instrument. And we're not paying anybody at that rate. We're paying everyone in a consistent way at what we judge to be equitable debt repayment arrangements that we've made with everybody else. So the courts ruled against Argentina, and basically, Argentina decided to take a page out of the verbal notebook of Victoria Nuland. You may know who Victoria Nuland is, but if you don't know who she is, she famously, in a recorded conversation, recorded by Russian intelligence, in referring to her, first of all, allies in Europe, which she was supposedly defending by extending the largesse of Europe to Ukraine by creating a coup in Ukraine to install a government there. She was taped, and in referencing her close friends in Europe, she used the phrase, I think everyone is old enough here to hear this, you've probably heard of these things before, fuck the EU, fuck the European Union, which was a sort of a fair expression of her deep regard and admiration for Western and European culture and economics and politics. Well, the Argentinians sort of took a page out of her vocabulary, and they basically said, fuck the US courts. They just walked away. Now, that's an interesting position, because that's actually a position which is something that had been discussed many years earlier by Lyndon LaRouche, the president of Mexico, then president of Mexico, Lopez Portillo, who had done exactly that in the summer of 1982 when he nationalized the banks of Mexico at the recommendation of Lyndon LaRouche. He met with LaRouche during May of that year, and then as a result of that meeting, LaRouche wrote a proposal for the president of Mexico called Operation Juarez, after the great Mexican and American patriot Benito Juarez, the founder of Mexico. And basically what he stated was that the nation of Mexico should not pay usurious debt to the International Monetary Fund. And that meant that a nationalistic action had to be taken by the president of Mexico to assert the sovereignty of Mexico over its financial destiny and future. Well, this is exactly what Argentinian repudiation of the usurious debt was. Let me also point out that this was the debt to a hedge fund. This was not a debt to the American government or to another state. And it was a debt to a set of financial institutions that had been bailed out, in fact, illegally, in the United States by the United States Congress. Well, what happened at that meeting in Fortaleza, Brazil, was that this BRICS nations process, involving over half of humanity, as was already said, surfaced and crystallized. And from that point, there has been a global world war that has been being conducted. You are presently sitting in the middle of processes that can only be compared to those of 1914, 1915, 100 years ago. You are presently sitting where people were sitting in July and August of 1939 before September 1st of 1939 and the declaration of World War II. And many people are in the same mental frame of mind that they were at that time. They had no idea that this was going on. Now, our organization's viewpoint and our organization